Welcome to Season 4 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Josh Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement and a former Commissioner of Health in Baltimore City. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to current topics in public health through engaging interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith-Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. Today is Indigenous Peoples Day. Dr. Josh Sharfstein talks to Dr. Sophie Neuner, a researcher with the Center for American Indian Health, who's also a member of the Karuk tribe. They discuss how to counter the erasure of Indigenous people from history by appreciating opportunities for improved Indigenous health today. Let's listen.
Dr. Sophie Neuner, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you, Josh? It's a pleasure to be here today.
Really appreciate your time. Now we're talking via Zoom, but I wonder, where are you physically?
Well, I'm currently based in my Aboriginal territory in what is now known as Northern California. I'm a Karuk person, from a member of the Karuk tribe, and Karuk literally translates to upriver. My ancestors have made their homes on the banks of the Klamath River since time immemorial, and I am very lucky to have been working and living at home since the beginning of the pandemic. It's been one of those, rare pandemic perks for me.
It sounds like a beautiful location too.
It's gorgeous. I think the best place on earth.
Let me ask you about your work, because you do work that relates to the Center for American Indian Health at Johns Hopkins. Tell me what you do there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working at the Johns Hopkins Center for American Indian Health as a research associate since August 2020. And originally I set out to do a lot of work pertaining to health communications, pertaining to training. We really are doing a lot of work at the center to recruit and support Native scholars, both at the School of Public Health and really across the university. One of my other parts of the job is to really promote Indigenous women's health. That is my passion. I am an aspiring obstetrician and gynecologist and hope to return to my tribal communities to serve my peoples with culturally congruent practices and care. So I've been doing a lot of work in the realms of, developing health communications, developing training relating to Indigenous women's health, as well as working on different reproductive health projects.
Oh, that sounds terrific. Now, this podcast is going to air, I understand, on October 11th, which is a day when I was growing up that was celebrated because it was the day that America was discovered, in theory, or the birthday of the person who discovered America, something like that. I'm not even exactly sure. But now it's more broadly known as Indigenous Peoples Day. And I wanted to ask you what this day, first of all, means for you.
So I like the way you phrased that. And I will rephrase it to say that, what was previously recognized as Columbus Day is really the day that Native Americans discovered Columbus. But I would say for me personally, it's sort of a day to reflect, and also I will say a day to educate. I think Indigenous Peoples Day is a lot about reclaiming history and giving people a more accurate portrayal of what the history of this country was. I will say I don't think Indigenous Peoples Day is about celebrating necessarily Indigenous identity for me personally. Others may see this differently, but I'm an Indigenous person every day, right? I think Indigenous Peoples Day is a lot about sort of rewriting history in a sense. So across the US, I think a lot of a lot of people have been sort of fed this false narrative of discovery when really our history is rooted in genocide. And to a lot of natives, Columbus Day sort of represents the beginning of that violent colonization that is ongoing in the United States.
So if one purpose of today is sort of the unerasure of the history of Indigenous people, what do you think are the key aspects of that? What do people really need to know? Maybe this is a day, as you point out, not so much for Indigenous people, but for others to really pause and think about what has been erased.
Absolutely. I really like the way you phrased that. I think for listeners out there, this is a good day to reflect and connect with the land that you currently occupy. It's a good day to find out who are the tribal people, who are the nations, who are the inheritance of the land that you are on. A good resource for that is a website, and I'd love to direct your listeners to it. It's native-land.ca. And it's a really great website that you can type in your zip code and find out who the Indigenous peoples are in your territory. And then it's also a day to sort of re-familiarize yourself with history, to talk to your kids about American history through an Indigenous lens, if you will say. It's also an important day to sort of find out how you can support Indigenous peoples living in your communities.
And one of the parts of the erasure is that people sometimes think there just aren't Indigenous people around.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really remarkable research that sort of shows that I think over almost 90% of statewide history curricula just don't even talk about Native history in a post-1900s context. And if you think about it, it's crazy, but then it also makes it really understandable that for a lot of non-Native folks, Indigenous peoples are sort of a thing that they view in sort of this prehistoric context, when that is so wrong. We are the fastest growing population in the United States today. The 2020 census showed that there are almost 3% of US Americans identify as Indigenous.
So help me understand for Baltimore, say, where Johns Hopkins is located, what the history is.
Yeah, so Johns Hopkins is located on the unceded lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations. And as I said, to this day, there are over 7,000 Indigenous peoples in Baltimore, many of them members of the Lumbee, Eastern Band of Cherokee, and Piscataway tribes, of many others.
You know, I think as I think about it, to the extent that the field of public health has largely been engaged with Indigenous health, it's often to point out the disparities that exist and the serious health challenges that are faced by Indigenous people and Indigenous communities. But in maybe its own little bit form of erasure, we don't really hear about the efforts that can be put into place that really make a difference. Absolutely.
I think that's a really important point to make. Yes, our communities are facing a lot of health disparities. And yes, it's in a sense, it is important to recognize that and to talk about it. But at the same time, you're doing a disservice to Indigenous communities if you don't at the same time highlight community strengths and Indigenous-driven solutions to these health issues.
So as you think about those, could you give our listeners a sense of what inspires you in the area of Indigenous health?
I mean, I think what inspires me is my own family, right? It's like my own community and just seeing all of the incredible efforts that my tribe and tribes in our area have put forth to ensure the health of not only our peoples, but the health of our relations, plant, animal, and mineral.
Can you give me an example or two?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a great example to talk about here would be the revitalization of fire practices. I think many of your listeners are aware of the catastrophic wildfires that really affect California and especially the Northern California area every summer. And it's important to look at the history of those wildfires. So back in the day, Indigenous tribes had ways to manage the landscape. And those ways often had to do with tending good fires. So we actually prescribed burns to sort of clear underbrush, to ensure our forests and meadows safety, to, promote healthy habitat for plants in the area, as well as fibers and plants that we used and continue to use culturally. Unfortunately, about 100 years ago, the United States Forest Service banned prescribed burning practices because they were deemed, I want to say, they were deemed sort of savage, I guess. And now we have the situation where we have a lot of monocultures in our forests, where we have really heavy fuels that are really the cause of these major burns. And wildfires threaten the lives of humans and plants every year. My tribe is leading the revitalization of our traditional burning practices. And it's only now that Western science has sort of caught up to the wisdom of these practices. So I think that's a really good example for how tribes are really leading a lot of the movement towards sustaining the health of our environment.
That is very interesting and not something I know much at all about. Maybe a good topic for a future podcast.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, speaking of podcasts, I understand that you have a new podcast.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about it. So my podcast, or rather the podcast I share with my co-hosts, Sarah Stern, who's a member of the Cherokee Nation, and Olivia Trujillo, who's a member of the Navajo Nation, is a community-grounded podcast that really celebrates and promotes Indigenous women's health and well-being. Listeners can subscribe to the Indigene podcast on all platforms. It is spelled INDIGENAE. We release new episodes every Thursday.
Now, give me some examples of what you're going to cover in this podcast about Indigenous women's health.
Yeah, so our podcast really shares conversations with traditional practitioners, Indigenous healthcare workers, activists, researchers, and survivors. We sort of cover different topics as they pertain to phases in Indigenous women's lifespans. So starting with coming of age, up to pregnancy and birth, up to becoming an elder, we talk about all of these different topics and sort of take our listeners on a virtual journey throughout Indian country, and in a sense also through Indigenous womanhood.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be great, and also a way for people who don't really have much of an appreciation of all of the things that are being done and can be done to advance Indigenous health to really learn.
Right, absolutely. It's really a podcast that is very strengths-based, right? We are not just talking to researchers. We are talking to cultural practitioners and activists and folks who have really dedicated their lives to these different topics. And in a sense, Indigene is a way of health communications through storytelling, which is a very traditional form of relaying information of health and well-being in Indigenous communities.
In a small way, it's undoing some of the damage that has been done by so many erasures of Indigenous people and Indigenous health.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially all of our guests are doing some monumental work in this field. Everybody's doing their part.
Well, Dr. Neuner, thank you so much for joining me today. This podcast sounds fantastic. I hope you have many, many listeners. And I also wish you the best with your work at the Center for American Indian Health and for your future training as a physician in obstetrics and gynecology.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Josh. And I appreciate being on this podcast today.
Public Health on Call is produced by Josh Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, Cian Oates, and Matthew Martin with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo and Neiman Outland. Social media support from Brenda Haggader, Grace Holes Fernandez, and Caroline Wong. Thank you for listening.